Hey friend, in today's watercolor tutorial, I'm going to be teaching how to paint this Northern Lights landscape of Yosemite National Park. Without further ado, let's get painting. For today's tutorial, I'm using Permanent Rose, Aqua Green, Veridian Green, Black, and Payne's Gray. And the paper I've taped down here is a size 5 by 7 inches. I'm also going to be using a size 4 and a size 6 round Princeton brush and a sponge brush. Almost forgot to mention I will be using Winsor Newton white gouache for our stars in our Northern Lights sky. To get started on our landscape here, I am just going to take some really watered down black, so mostly water with just barely a touch of black, and just sketch out part of El Capitan here. And I'm starting about 2 inches below the top of the painting on the left side, and I'm just going to sketch out a slight curve. You can see it's sloping slightly upward, and then it's going to go back down just a hair. It's very subtle. It's almost hardly noticeable, but just very slight. And then I'm going to bring down this point to sketch out the nose of El Capitan. And after about an inch of straight down, I'm going to curve out the rest of El Caps just slightly. Then from here, about halfway of this length, I'm going to just do a slightly angled line that's sort of sloping downward just a hair, and then bring it back down. Okay, and then from here, I want to take my sponge brush and I am just going to saturate the top of our painting fully with water. And I want to basically get this wet area ready to roll for some of our wet and wet technique that we're going to be utilizing for our galaxy sky. And we're going to be using some Permanent Rose, and actually, come to think about it, as I was about to list those, we're going to be using all of these colors for the galaxy. So have those ready to roll on hand. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears to my size 6 brush now. And I like to start with our lighter colors first, typically, especially for galaxies. And I'm just going to start with our Veridian Green to begin. And I just want to get some subtle curve waves. And I am starting with kind of an S curve to begin with. It's very subtle and simple. I feel like I'm getting a little bit of some crumbles of paint, but not a huge deal. Those will kind of dilute with the water. So I've got this subtle kind of S curve, and it's expanding towards the top right corner. From here, I'd like to do another simple S curve, and I'm going to do one over towards the left here. This one, maybe it's pointed more vertically instead of in a corner. And maybe this one's just a little bit wider. And then I'm going to do a third one off towards the right. And this one's just more broad and simple. Okay, and then from here, I do want to have some aqua greens. So I'm gonna just kind of layer softly some Aqua Green. I don't want to fully saturate over the entirety of the Veridian Green, but I'm just adding a touch kind of on either side here, allowing the color to kind of bleed and blend with the water. And as needed, you can add more water to help soften some of these blends. And you can even add some more Veridian Green if needed to layer. This is where kind of the fun begins, with just playing with the color and water ratios and the pigment values from light to dark. Here I'm just adding a touch more Veridian Green, just kind of layering that on. I'm gonna add a little bit more over to the left as well. And a little bit in this white gap here. And I want to just layer up a touch more of our Aqua Green. And again, I'm kind of following that kind of S curve formation or C curves as well, just so that way there's some subtle curvature. Okay, so I'm going to layer up just a hair more Veridian Green in this area here. As the paint dries, it may dilute in its value just a little bit as the paper absorbs the water and the pigment. So as needed, you can kind of play with adding a little bit more depth and value to the color. Next, I want to add just a hair of some pink. I'm using Permanent Rose, which is super potent. It's really just a nice, vibrant rose color. And I just want a little bit of a hint of it because in some photos I saw of the Northern Lights with El Capitan that happened a few weeks ago, there was some pink in the sky, which I think is so cool. So I just want to add a touch of pink, just a little bit. It'll almost turn slightly purple as it mixes with the blue, but I just love kind of a surprise pop of the vibrancy of this pink and how it layers really nicely with the Aqua Green and Veridian Green. So it's very soft and subtle, but I'm just gonna do a couple areas where you just see kind of a pop of a hint of the pink. Okay, I absolutely love the just really subtle hints of that pink. I now want to add just a little bit of contrast by mixing up some Payne's gray with just a touch of black. And this is going to be our darkest color in the sky. And I don't want too much of it, but just a little bit to overlap in some of the darker aqua green areas. This is just going to add a touch of contrast. And if needed, you can add some more water to these areas to help soften any of the blends. But if your paper is nice and wet, that probably won't be needed. So I'm just going through and just adding a subtle amount of some contrast here. Okay, and before we finish up, I'm gonna relayer, you guessed it, a little bit of Veridian Green because I feel like it's kind of getting lost a little bit. So I'm actually gonna mix up some Veridian Green with just a touch of Aqua Green, just to make it a little bit more potent, with some water. And then I am just simply gonna kind of layer that on in our Northern Light highlights here. And I feel like that's just making them pop a little bit more. Perfect. Okay, so once I have this layered on, I'm just gonna let this sky dry a little bit. And when we come back, we can move on to the next step of our painting. Now that our sky is dry, I'm gonna just take some Payne's gray and mix it with a little bit of black. And so if you already have that blend on hand, you can just reuse that. And I'm just gonna water it down a little bit. I want kind of a lighter value of this blend. And I'm just going to take my size 6 brush and plenty of water to just kind of evenly saturate the face of El Capitan. And I'm gonna go all the way along the edge where the Northern Lights are. And I want this kind of cool toned medium value gray. And then I'm just gonna let this wash dry. And while it's drying, I'm gonna take my size 4 brush now and add some stars in the darker areas of the Northern Lights. And I'm just gonna use really light pressure with the tip of my brush just to place some irregular dots in the darker areas, being mindful that the Northern Lights don't really show stars in the actual highlight areas themselves, but just in the dark areas. right, next I'm just gonna take a little bit of water and dip my size 4 brush into our Payne's Gray and Black blend, and then tap it a little bit on a paper towel just to absorb excess water. And I'm gonna do a dry brushing technique where I just take the side of my brush and I'm just getting this nice rock kind of texture on the face of El Capitan. This is just gonna add more shading and depth, and then obviously some variegation in the rock face so it's not one solid gray, even layer of paint. So I'm just kind of layering this up. And once I get to kind of the bridge of the nose, I'm just gonna outline this just slightly, just so there's some separation of the second rock kind of coming off of El Capitan here. So I'm just gonna kind of fill that and separate it with a little bit of a deeper gray. And then I'm just gonna carry on layering this nice dry brush texture using the belly of my brush at a side angle. It's almost fully horizontal. All right, now that I've added that texture to El Capitan, I'm just gonna let it set and dry. And I'm just gonna take my size 6 brush and kind of sketch a just simple loose outline of a lake, or in this case, it's actually a river. It's the Merced River. And here we're gonna have some color kind of reflecting what's going on in the sky just a little bit. But before we do, I wanna paint our base for our pine trees here. And since it's a dark night and a dark sky, we're not gonna see too much detail just above the river. So I'm just gonna paint some black here to start. And keeping it kind of a loose, rough edge against the river here, so that way it's not a perfectly smooth line. There's some variegation in the texture here, so just kind of a loose, rough texture. And then painting black above there. Just a nice solid layer. If needed to fully saturate it, you can add a second layer depending on how much water was already there. And I'm just gonna bring this slightly upward, all the way to the white that's left behind here. And just up against El Capitan. Okay, so from this point, I want to take my size 4 brush and I'm just carrying on with just black, and I'm going to lay out some pine trees. And before I add any detail to pine trees, I really just like to get the format out. So I like to lay out the trunks, which is basically just a vertical line to start. And I really like to play with the variety of height. So have some that are larger or taller, have some that are slightly small. So maybe there's a couple small ones in this area by the nose of El Capitan. Have a few larger ones, and just really play around with the height of the trees. And then from here, I am just going to use very light pressure with the tip of my brush. And mentally, I'm kind of following a visual in my head of a cone shape, where the base of the tree gradually widens towards the bottom and the very top is nice and narrow. And on either side, there's a lot of texture. So a lot of just simple loose texture to mimic the branches and the pine needles of the pine tree. But I'm basically just starting with very, very light texture at the top, hardly anything as you can see. And then I slowly, ever so slightly, gradually increase the width as I work my brush down the vertical line of the trunk till we've got kind of just a simple, loose cone shape silhouette. And I'm just gonna carry on this process of doing the pine trees. And if by some chance the top of any of your pine trees started out a little bit too wide as you started doing your brushwork here, you can always just elongate the top of the tree and add a little bit more of a vertical line just to kind of redo the skinniness, if you will, of the very tippy top of the tree. And that'll just kind of help get that nice cone shape. And it's okay if some white or background is popping through the tree in between the branches as well. Now to just help the transition between the line of the pine trees and the ground below, I'm just going to take some black using my size 4 brush and just tap my brush alongside this transition area, so that way it's not too much of an awkward transition, but there's just some loose texture of the ground below. Just kind of layered with the black. And next up, I want to kind of add a little bit of color to the water down below. And I'm going to start just like we did before with our Veridian Green. And I want to make sure to mix it just with a touch of the Aqua Green as well, just to make it pop a little bit more. And I'm basically just going to try to mimic kind of a reflection of some of the colors that we see here. So just kind of reversing what's in the sky, starting with a narrow amount of the color and widening it slightly. And then I want to do the same thing just a little bit over here as well. I'm just gonna add some water alongside the edges and then add just some straight aqua green. Kind of mimicking that S curve slightly. And then from here, I want to take a little bit more aqua green and some water. And the rest of the white areas here. And just kind of layer that up a little bit. And then just add a touch of our permanent rose. Just allowing that to softly blend and bleed out. I'm just going to use some water to soften these blends a little bit and a little bit of pressure with my brush. And here I just want to add just a touch more Veridian Green, just to make that color kind of pop in here. And then I'm just gonna let this water set a little bit, but before I do, I'm just gonna add just a couple touches of the blend of the Payne's gray and the black. So just adding a couple touches of that, just to add a little bit more contrast. I don't want it to overpower the color too much, but just to add a little bit of a pop. While the water dries, I always have to add a shooting star. I thought maybe I won't do it this time, but I can't resist it. I just have to. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of a crooked dash line in one of the dark areas. So it's just a simple dash line at an angle using the white gouache, just like so. And I just used very light pressure with the tip of my size 4 brush. And I think that just adds like a nice whimsical flair to the landscape. Thank you so much for joining me for today's Yosemite Northern Lights watercolor tutorial. Be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss any further landscape tutorials on my channel.